The boutique's glass door swung open, its chime barely audible over the soft hum of the store's ambient music. At first glance, the woman who entered appeared like any other customer. Mid-30s, her dark brown hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, wearing a simple black jacket over a white blouse and dark jeans. She looked ordinary, almost forgettable, but the moment she stepped inside the luxury store, everything seemed to shift. The high-end boutique was filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the gleam of polished marble floors. Designer handbags hung from golden racks, and rows of shoes, each more pristine than the last, lined the shelves. It was a world she wasn't used to. A world that felt out of place for someone like her. Yet, here she was. She hesitated for a moment, her heels clicking lightly against the floor as she glanced around. She wasn't here to shop, nor did she care for the overpriced leather bags that adorned the walls. She was here for something far more important, something no one in this store could ever imagine. The manager, a sharply dressed man in his mid-50s, noticed her immediately. He had an air about him, something about his posture that said he wasn't just a store manager, he was the king of this little realm. His expensive suit, silver watch, and polished shoes screamed authority, and he knew how to use it. He glanced up from his desk as the woman walked past the tall shelves, her footsteps seeming louder now. The woman looked uneasy. She glanced at a few items, her fingers brushing lightly against the soft leather of a bag, but it was clear she wasn't here to browse. She was here for something far more personal. The manager narrowed his eyes, noticing how out of place she looked in the sleek, luxurious environment. Her clothes were clean, but nothing remarkable. Her shoes, sensible, not the high-end brands displayed throughout the store. She didn't belong here. "Can I help you, miss?" the manager asked, his voice calm but laced with a subtle edge. The woman turned toward him, her expression briefly faltering. She was used to this, used to the way people looked at her, as though she were somehow beneath them, despite her having everything they could only dream of. "I'm just looking," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. His frown deepened. "This is a high-end store, miss. We cater to a specific clientele. I'm afraid this may not be the right place for you." The words hit harder than she expected. She had grown used to prejudice in her life, but this? This felt different. There was a finality in his voice, an assumption of superiority. She took a deep breath, her grip tightening around the edge of the display case she had been absent-mindedly touching. "I'm sorry, I'm not here to buy anything," she replied, trying to steady her voice. The manager, still staring at her with a mix of suspicion and distaste, shook his head. "If you're not here to purchase anything, I'm afraid you'll need to leave." A spark of frustration flared in her chest. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to justify her presence to him. And yet, she found herself almost apologizing. She started, but her words caught in her throat. She couldn't let him see her struggle. "I'm asking you to leave," he cut in, his tone colder now, more final. The woman stood still, caught between rage and disbelief. This was happening. She was being thrown out of the store, not because of who she was but because of how he saw her. This wasn't the first time in her life that someone had judged her by her appearance, but something about this situation felt different. This wasn't just a matter of class or status. There was something deeper at play, something that hurt more than she cared to admit. With a stiff nod, she forced herself to turn toward the door. The store manager's gaze followed her, watching with an almost smug satisfaction. He had dismissed her, and it seemed that was all that mattered to him. Her feet moved almost on autopilot as she stepped out of the store, the door chiming behind her. The cool air of the street hit her face like a slap, a harsh contrast to the warmth of the boutique. She stood there for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened. It wasn't just the dismissal, it was the way he'd looked at her, as though she didn't even belong on the same street as the store. Her mind raced with thoughts of anger, frustration, and a deep, burning shame. She didn't belong there, not in the eyes of the manager or anyone else who thought like him. But what hurt most wasn't that she had been dismissed. It was that, for a brief moment, she had believed him. She had allowed his judgment to seep into her, even for a second. But that was about to change. She took a deep breath, her fingers twitching in her jacket pockets. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. This was the moment she had been waiting for. It wasn't just the manager or the boutique that she had come to confront, it was the world that had looked down on her for far too long. With a final glance back at the store, she pulled out her phone and made a single call. "Hello?" The street was bustling with the noise of the midday crowd, but the woman felt as though she were standing in the eye of a storm. The anger and humiliation still burned in her chest, threatening to explode. Her hands shook slightly as she held her phone to her ear, the cold touch of the metal pressing against her skin. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, almost robotic in its professionalism. "Good afternoon, this is Mr. Simmons' office. How may I assist you?" She took a steadying breath, her mind racing as the phone call continued. "I need to speak with Mr. Simmons. It's urgent. Tell him it's about the boutique in the city center." There was a long pause on the other end, the silence thick enough to make her stomach churn. Then, the voice spoke again, sounding more cautious. "I'll need to check with Mr. Simmons first. Please hold." She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning against the cool glass of the store window she had just been ejected from. It felt like the entire world was slipping through her fingers. Just moments ago, she had been a woman with nothing more than the simple desire to speak to someone in charge, and now she was something more, a person with a power she wasn't even sure she fully understood. The irony wasn't lost on her, the same boutique that had just dismissed her like she was nothing had now become the key to everything she had worked for. It was the first step in the long road of taking back what was hers. The phone clicked back to life. "Mr. Simmons will be expecting your call, ma'am. Please hold while I transfer you." The line crackled, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment for years, the moment when her plans would finally come together. Another click. Ms. Sullivan, the voice of Mr. Simmons, the man who had overseen the acquisition, came through loud and clear. "What can I do for you?" The coolness in his voice was exactly what she needed to hear. It reminded her of everything she had fought through to get here. "You can start by telling me what's going on in my store." Simmons was silent for a beat. She could hear the rustle of papers on the other end. "What are you referring to, Ms. Sullivan?" She clenched her fist around the phone. "A manager by the name of Marcus had the audacity to kick me out of my store. I walked in, trying to figure out the final details of the transition, and he treated me like I didn't belong there." The words spilled out, thick with disbelief and frustration. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, but now, speaking to Simmons directly, it felt almost surreal. The intensity of her Another silence stretched between them, this time heavier. She could practically hear the gears turning in Simmons' head as he processed her words. "I see," he finally said. That was unfortunate. I'll have a word with him." "Unfortunate?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Mr. Simmons, I'm more than just unfortunate. I've been trying to take over the company for weeks now, making sure every detail is in place for this transition. And the first thing that happens when I finally step into the store is a man with the nerve to treat me like that?" Mr. Simmons cleared his throat. "It's not that simple, Ms. Sullivan. Marcus is just protective of the store. He's been with the company for decades, and..." Her voice cracked with frustration. "I don't care how long he's been there. It's my store now. It's always been my store. Silence again. Then, a sigh. "You're right, Ms. Sullivan. I'll handle it. But I need you to be patient with this process. I understand your anger, but you've waited this long. One more day won't hurt. Trust me, we're doing everything we can to make this transition as smooth as possible." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. Patience. It wasn't something she had much of left, not after everything she had been through. But it was a part of the game. One more day. That's all she had to wait. Just one more day before everything started to fall into place. "I don't want to hear about one more delay," she said through gritted teeth. "I want him out of my store by the end of the day. I'll handle the rest." The line went dead for a moment, and then Simmons spoke again. "Understood, Ms. Sullivan. We'll handle it right away." She hung up without saying another word. Her heart was still pounding, but now, it was more out of anticipation than anger. This was the moment she had been working toward. It was her turn to take control. The rest of the afternoon passed by in a blur. She couldn't focus. Couldn't settle. As soon as she had gotten off the phone with Simmons, she had walked a few blocks away from the store, taking in the busy streets of the city, trying to calm herself. She didn't want to seem desperate, but that's exactly what she felt like. Desperate for the control she had been fighting for so long. Every step she took felt like it was getting her closer to something, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The manager, Marcus, had no idea who he had just kicked out. No idea that he was about to lose everything he had worked for. But that didn't matter. What mattered now was what she was going to do next. She couldn't afford to let anyone stand in her way. By the time she returned to her apartment that evening, her mind was racing. She knew that the next few hours were going to be critical, everything depended on them. She had made plans. Big plans. Simmons would be in touch again soon, but it wouldn't be for the reasons he thought. The next steps would come quickly, and once they started, there would be no going back. The hours crawled by like molasses, each minute dragging its feet as the woman sat alone in her apartment, the silence pressing in on her. Her thoughts raced, twisting and turning, reflecting on everything that had led her to this moment. Every detail from her past, every decision, every battle, all of it had built up to this singular point. The irony was almost overwhelming. Just a few months ago, she had been scrambling to find a way out of a life that had left her with nothing but empty promises. Now, she was sitting on top of everything, everything she had ever wanted. Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking her from her thoughts. She grabbed it with urgency, her eyes scanning the screen as she read the message from Mr. Simmons. "Marcus is no longer managing the store. Arrangements have been made. You should visit tomorrow for a formal walkthrough of your property. You're now in full control. Congratulations, Ms. Sullivan." The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't settle in her heart as she had hoped. She had always known that the path to ownership wouldn't be easy, but this? The satisfaction was hollow. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel something. Relief? Maybe. But it didn't last long. She had worked too hard to let this small victory be the end. Her phone buzzed again. A call this time. It was Simmons. Her hand trembled slightly as she answered. "Ms. Sullivan," his voice came through, as clipped as ever, "I just wanted to confirm that we've handled the transition smoothly. Everything is in place. We're all set for tomorrow's meeting. I'll have someone accompany you to walk through the store. You should be ready for a smooth and professional experience." Her mind whirled, still not quite able to accept the reality of what had just happened. Marcus, the man who had so arrogantly kicked her out earlier, was gone. She had no idea what had happened to him, or why he had been removed so quickly, but a part of her didn't care. What mattered was what came next. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons," she replied, forcing herself to sound composed. "I'll be there tomorrow." Before he could respond, she ended the call, her mind already shifting toward the next phase. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, but she was starting to realize that she might not be as ready as she had thought. She had always been the outsider, always on the fringes, and now that she had everything she'd ever dreamed of. The morning came too quickly, as mornings often did. She had barely slept, tossing and turning, haunted by the thought of Marcus and what might have been his fate. She had no idea what had transpired behind closed doors, but the sudden removal of a man who had been in charge for decades had to mean something. Had he been fired? Or worse? She dressed quickly, pulling on a tailored jacket and a pair of sleek black trousers. Her reflection in the mirror looked confident, poised, someone who was in control. The woman who had walked into that store yesterday, the one who had been rejected and humiliated, felt like a distant memory now. She wasn't that person anymore. When she arrived at the boutique, the city's skyline looming in the distance, the store was empty. There were no bustling customers, no chatter, no constant hum of the store's staff preparing for another busy day. Instead, everything was eerily still, the silence broken only by the clicking of her heels on the polished floors. The air in the store felt thick with tension, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. As she entered the boutique, the door chimed, but no one greeted her. The space felt cold, sterile, even. She looked around, her eyes scanning the pristine displays, the gleaming glass cases, the bright lights that seemed almost too harsh now. This wasn't hers yet. Not fully. There was still work to be done. It wasn't until she reached the back of the store that she finally saw someone. A man in a crisp suit stood in the hallway that led to the offices, his hands folded behind his back as he watched her approach. "Ms. Sullivan, welcome," he said, his voice polite but detached. "I'm Thomas, and I've been assigned to show you around today. If you'll follow me, we can start the walkthrough." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was nerves or something else. Thomas led her deeper into the store, and with every step, her mind raced. This was it. She was about to be handed everything. The life she had worked for, the dream she had fought so hard to achieve. They reached the back office, and Thomas opened the door, stepping aside for her to enter. The office was exactly as she remembered it, sleek, modern, with a large desk at the center of the room, paperwork neatly arranged. But there was something wrong, something off about the atmosphere. It felt like something was missing, like a shadow lingering in the corner of the room. "Everything's in order here," Thomas said as he gestured to the desk. "All you need to do is sign the final documents and you'll be fully in charge." She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the papers spread across the desk, each one marking a new chapter in her life. She should have felt elated, but instead, a knot formed in her stomach. She reached out slowly, her hand hovering over the papers. But before something that shouldn't have been there. Underneath the stack of papers was a folded letter, half hidden from view. It was addressed to her, the handwriting neat and formal, though it felt oddly personal. Curiosity flickered in her chest as she picked it up, unfolding the paper with shaking hands. "Ms. Sullivan," the letter began, "I know you're about to take full ownership of the store. But there's something you need to know. Marcus isn't just a manager. He's much more. What you saw yesterday was a show, a performance meant to test your resolve. But don't be fooled. There are forces at play here that you don't understand. Be careful who you trust. Not everything is as it seems." Her breath caught in her throat. The letter fell from her hands, the words haunting her as they echoed in her mind. Forces at play? What did that mean? And who had written this? Thomas turned to face her, his eyes darting briefly to the letter on the desk, then back to her. Is there a problem, Miss Sullivan? Her heart raced, but she forced a smile. No. Everything's fine. But as she signed the papers and took her place behind the desk, a sense of unease settled in. The mystery was only beginning. The silence in the office was deafening. The letter, still lying on the desk, seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. Each word felt like a weight, dragging her down into the unknown. Marcus wasn't just a manager. The letter claimed he was part of something bigger, a show to test her. She had thought she was done with surprises, but clearly, she was only scratching the surface. Her fingers hovered over the letter, but she couldn't bring herself to pick it up again. The ink on the paper seemed to blur in her vision, the words twisting in her mind as she tried to make sense of them. Who would send something like this? And why? Thomas, who had been silently watching her from across the room, cleared his throat, breaking her out of her trance. Ms. Sullivan, he said, his voice polite but with an edge of impatience, if you're ready to proceed, I can arrange for the final signatures and a quick walk through the store. She snapped the letter up, quickly folding it and slipping it into her pocket. She needed to stay focused. She needed to push through this. After everything she'd been through, she couldn't afford to get distracted by a cryptic note. Still, the unease in her stomach wouldn't go away. I'm ready, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas led her out of the office and into the back corridors of the store. The lights were brighter now, casting sharp shadows against the walls as they walked. The store seemed different, almost alien, now that she had the title of owner. The rows of merchandise, the neatly organized racks, the glass counters, all of it seemed to take on a new meaning. This was her domain. As they moved through the store, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt louder than it had before, the air thicker. She glanced over her shoulder, but the store was empty. It shouldn't have felt so unsettling, but it did. There was a sense of wrongness that she couldn't quite place. They stopped near the front of the boutique, and Thomas handed her a stack of documents. These are the final contracts, Ms. Sullivan, he said, his voice clipped. Once you sign them, everything is officially yours. The store. The inventory. All of it. She took the documents, her eyes skimming over the pages. They looked straightforward enough. Legal jargon, percentages, profit margins. But as she flipped through them, one sentence stood out, a sentence that made her blood run cold. This agreement is subject to all previous contracts, including those involving third-party operations and managerial oversight. The words seemed harmless enough, but something about them sent a chill down her spine. Third-party operations? What did that mean? And why hadn't she seen it in the original paperwork? Her hands tightened around the documents as she glanced at Thomas, who was still standing at her side, his expression unreadable. What third-party operations? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Thomas's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he answered, it's a standard clause. There's nothing to worry about, Miss Sullivan. Just a formality. But her instincts told her otherwise. The unease, the letter, Marcus' sudden removal, everything was connected. And she wasn't being told the whole truth. Before she could press him further, the door to the store opened with a sharp creak, breaking the tension. A woman stepped inside, her presence immediate and commanding. She was tall, dressed in a dark coat that seemed far too formal for the boutique's casual aesthetic. Her face was partially obscured by sunglasses, but there was something about the way she carried herself, confident, purposeful, that immediately caught the woman's attention. Miss Sullivan, the woman called, her voice cool but not unfriendly. She turned to face her, startled by the interruption. Yes? Can I help you? The woman removed her sunglasses, revealing a pair of piercing blue eyes that studied her intently. I'm here to discuss your transition, she said smoothly. I'm Sophia. I was, well, I suppose you could say, an old associate of Marcus. The woman's stomach tightened. Another connection to Marcus. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't seem to fit. What do you mean, associate? Sophia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Let's just say that Marcus wasn't the only one with a stake in this store. I've been keeping an eye on. Sophia's words sent a ripple through her. Keeping an eye on things, she repeated. Who are you, really? And why are you here? Thomas, who had been standing silently by her side, stepped forward. Sophia is an advisor, Ms. Sullivan. She's been handling some of the operations, the woman interrupted, feeling the heat rise in her chest. What operations? And why wasn't I informed about this? Sophia raised an eyebrow but didn't flinch. The operations are part of the bigger picture, Ms. Sullivan. You're stepping into something much larger than you realize. We all have our parts to play. The words hung in the air, thick with implications. The woman felt her heart race. Larger than she realized? What was she missing? I don't need anyone's help, she snapped, her patience thinning. I'm the one who worked for this. I'm the one who made it happen. So if there's something going on behind the scenes, I expect you to tell me now. Sophia didn't react to her outburst. She simply regarded the woman with an unreadable expression. I'm just here to make sure the transition goes smoothly, she said, her tone suddenly much colder. But you're right. You should know the full truth. Her eyes met the woman's. Marcus wasn't just a manager. He was part of a larger group, people who control things behind the scenes. And they'll be watching you, Ms. Sullivan. They've been watching you for a very long time. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. The walls of the store suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick with secrets. Who were these people? And what did they want from her? You can't just come in here and make threats, she said, her voice trembling despite herself. I'm in charge now. Not you. Not Marcus. Me. Sophia's lips curved into a slight smile. We'll see about that. Before the woman could respond, Sophia turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. The door shut behind her with a soft thud, leaving the woman alone in the silence once more. Thomas didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching her carefully. The woman's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. Marcus had been part of something far bigger than she had realized. And now Sophia, whoever she really was clearly trying to play some kind of game. But what was the real game? Who could she trust? As she stared at the door where Sophia had just exited, a single thought echoed in her mind. This was only the beginning. The door clicked shut behind Sophia, and the woman stood motionless for a moment, her breath shallow, her mind racing. What had just happened? Who were these people? And what did they want from her? The cryptic words Sophia had left hanging in the air kept echoing in her mind. She had thought she had worked hard enough to earn this. To take control of the boutique. But now, with every step she took through the sleek, silent aisles, she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed was beginning to crack. There was more to this than just ownership. Something dark was lurking beneath the surface. The sound of a door opening behind her snapped her back to reality. Thomas stepped forward, his expression unreadable as usual. Ms. Sullivan, we can proceed with the signing whenever you're ready, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The woman barely glanced at him. The papers in her hand felt like a foreign object now. Her fingers tightened around the stack, feeling the weight of them, almost suffocating. She wanted to trust the process. She wanted to believe in this victory. But too many questions were swirling, and the unanswered ones were beginning to gnaw at her. Before we do anything, Thomas, she said, turning slowly to face him, I need to know what's really going on here. Who is Sophia? And what did she mean when she said they've been watching me for a long time? Thomas blinked, his calm demeanor slipping for a moment. I think you should focus on the task at hand, he replied carefully. There are some things you're not ready to understand yet. It's better if you just proceed with caution. Her heart skipped a beat. Proceed with caution. That was the last thing she wanted to hear. She had fought so hard to be here, to claim this place as her own. And now, there were forces at play that she didn't even understand. She wasn't just going to back down. Answer me, she demanded, her voice sharp. What is going on here? I'm not going to just sit back and let this whole situation unfold on its own. I need answers. Now. For a long moment, Thomas didn't respond. The tension in the air was thick, the silence stretching between them. The woman could see the internal battle in his eyes, the conflict he was trying to hide. And then, finally, he spoke. I told you, Sophia's involvement is complicated. She's part of a group. A network of influential people who have an interest in this store, and you. The words stung like ice. An interest in her? She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything pressing in on her chest. What do you mean, an interest in me? Thomas hesitated. There are expectations. Obligations tied to this place, Miss Sullivan. Things that go back a long time. Marcus wasn't just a manager. He was a part of a bigger plan. And so are you. She shook her head, her thoughts spinning. A bigger plan? What kind of plan? You're talking in riddles, Thomas. Either you tell me everything or I walk out that door right now. He didn't answer right away, but when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the edge of professionalism and had turned almost regretful. You're in over your head. And whether you like it or not, there are things you will have to accept. Some decisions are already out of your control. Her hands trembled as she gripped the papers tighter. She was not going to let anyone dictate her fate. Not now. Not after all she'd done to get here. There's more to this than you're telling me, she said, her voice quieter, but no less firm. And I'm going to find out what it is. You can't keep me in the dark forever. Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to glance back at her. Just be careful, Miss Sullivan, he said, his tone soft but heavy with meaning. The people you're dealing with aren't the ones you want as enemies. With that, he left her standing alone in the vast emptiness of the boutique, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights filling the void. She stood there for a while, her mind a tangled mess of questions and fear. Every part of her wanted to run. To leave this place behind and walk away from everything. But she knew deep down that she couldn't. Not after everything. Not after she had fought for this, fought for the chance to have something that was entirely hers. Her eyes flicked to the stack of papers still sitting on the desk. The documents that would seal her fate. She didn't trust any of this. She didn't trust Thomas. She didn't trust Sophia. And most of all, she didn't trust the way this store had suddenly become a battleground, a stage for something far larger than she had anticipated. But she couldn't back down now. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out the papers and started to sign, her hand moving mechanically across the lines. She paused only when she reached the last signature. Obligations tied to this place. The words from Thomas echoed in her mind again, and she felt the weight of them more keenly now. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she was in it. All in. There was no turning back. The final signature fell on the last dotted line, and the deed was done. The next few days passed in a blur. The boutique, now officially hers, felt like both a dream and a nightmare at the same time. She spent her hours walking through the store, organizing inventory, and trying to regain some semblance of control. But the shadow of Sophia's warning hung over her like a cloud, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And then, one afternoon, it happened. The door to the boutique opened with its usual chime, but this time, it wasn't the soft footsteps of a customer. It was something else. A man stepped inside, tall, dressed in a black suit that looked too formal for the setting. His eyes were cold, sharp, calculating. He didn't say a word. He just walked past her, as if he had every right to be there. She stood frozen for a moment, watching him. There was something off about him, something she couldn't place. But before she could approach him, he was already at the... Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a customer. This man knew something she didn't. And his arrival felt like a warning. She couldn't let him get away without answers. With a sense of urgency building in her chest, she followed him. The office door was cracked open just a sliver, and she could hear murmurs of conversation on the other side. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. "We have to move fast. She's already signed. We can't let her get too comfortable." A cold shiver ran down her spine. They were talking about her. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away from the door, her mind reeling. She needed answers, and she needed them now. There was no going back. The door to the office creaked open wider, and the murmur of voices on the other side grew louder. Sophia's words echoed in her mind. "They've been watching you for a long time." Who were they? And why had they been watching her? The thought made her skin crawl. She needed to know. Now. Her breath was shallow as she stood frozen just outside the office door, her hand gripping the frame to steady herself. She could hear the man's voice clearly now, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "We need to move fast. She signed everything. We can't let her change her mind." The man's voice was cold and methodical. A chill ran down her spine. What did he mean by "move fast" and "can't let her change her mind"? Was this some sort of conspiracy? Was she a pawn in someone else's game? Taking a deep breath, she slowly backed away from the door and turned to face the boutique. The bright, polished shelves that had once symbolized her hard-earned success now felt like a cage. She had walked into something much bigger than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about owning the boutique anymore, it was about survival. She had made a decision, she would find out everything. There was no turning back now. Whatever it took, she had to uncover the truth. The next day, Sophia hadn't returned to the boutique, and the mysterious man who had entered the office the day before hadn't been seen again either. But the unease lingered. The silence was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. The woman decided to take matters into her own hands. She had learned enough to know that whatever this was, it was serious, and it wasn't going away. After closing hours, she made her way into the office. It was time to get answers. The files that Thomas had left on the desk the other day, those same papers that had seemed so inconspicuous, held the key to everything. She grabbed the folder, flipping through it as she scanned for any clue that could explain the strange happenings in the store. And then she found it. A letter, written in neat, precise handwriting, was tucked between two official documents. She pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the crisp paper. Dear Ms. Sullivan, we are pleased to inform you that your inclusion in the network has been confirmed. As discussed, your role as the new owner of the boutique is crucial to the success of our mutual interests. It is imperative that you maintain a low profile during the initial phase of your involvement. However, there are certain obligations that come with this opportunity. You will be expected to meet with a representative at a later date to discuss your responsibilities further. Failure to adhere to the outlined terms will result in consequences. We trust that you understand the gravity of this situation. The decision is yours, but you must know, there are no easy exits once you've joined our network. Regards. A friend. The letter was a blow to her chest. A network. What kind of network was this? The words, "no easy exits," hung ominously in the air. She wasn't just involved in a business transaction, she had been pulled into something much darker, something much bigger than herself. As she reread the letter, a cold realization washed over her: this wasn't just a store. It wasn't just about ownership, or even money. She had become part of a web, tangled with people who held far more power than she had ever imagined. Her heart raced as she realized the full scope of the situation. The boutique wasn't just a business. It was a front for something much larger. A network of influential individuals, pulling strings behind the scenes. And she was now a part of it, whether she liked it or not. She felt trapped. The meeting. The following evening, her phone buzzed with a text. The message was short but chilling. Meeting at 8 p.m. Same location. Don't be late. It was signed simply with a single letter, A. Her pulse quickened. She knew she couldn't ignore this. She had to go. There were no other options. At precisely 8 p.m., she arrived at the location, a sleek, modern building downtown. It wasn't far from the boutique, but the place felt like a different world entirely. The lobby was dimly lit, and the only sound was the faint hum of the elevator. As she stepped inside, her footsteps echoed in the silence, the elevator doors opened on the top floor, and a man in a suit was waiting for her. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed a certain coldness. This was no casual meeting. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Please, follow me." She didn't hesitate. She had no choice. He led her down a hallway and into a spacious, sterile room. The walls were adorned with abstract art, and the air was thick with tension. As soon as she stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind her. The man took a seat at a polished conference table. "Thank you for coming," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an unsettling intensity. "I trust you've been briefed on your role." "Briefed?" she scoffed. "I've barely scratched the surface of what's going on. This network, the store, none of it makes sense." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he studied her. "You'll understand in time. But for now, it's important that you know what you've gotten yourself into." Her heart pounded in her chest. "I didn't get myself into anything. I signed some papers. I didn't know what I was signing up for." He raised an eyebrow. "You always knew, deep down. People like you, people who come into power, who take control, they know. And you wanted this. You just didn't realize what it would cost." The words stung more than she expected. She wanted to lash out, but she held herself in check. Instead, she pressed on, trying to gather whatever strength she had left. "I want to know what's really going on here," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor she could feel deep inside. "What do you want from me? What are you going to make me do?" The man's gaze softened, just for a moment. But his next words were cold, final. "You'll learn soon enough. But first, you need to understand something very important. You're in the middle of something far bigger than you. And getting out is not an option." A chill ran down her spine. The next morning, she woke up in a cold sweat, the weight of the meeting heavy on her chest. The man's words still echoed in her mind, cold and unsettling: getting out is not an option. She had tried to push it aside, telling herself that she had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. But the truth was, she wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. The boutique, her newly acquired business, felt like a cage. It was the place she had worked so hard to claim, yet it now felt like the center of a storm she couldn't escape. Every corner, every display, every piece of merchandise seemed to hold a secret she wasn't supposed to uncover. The walls closed in around her, suffocating her. She had become a pawn. A mere piece in a larger game, one where the rules were never explained, and there was no way to win. Her dreams of success, of independence, felt like distant memories. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there was still a flicker of defiance. She wasn't going to let them control her. Not without a fight. The dark truth. Sophia hadn't contacted her in days, and the strange man who had visited the boutique had not returned. Still, the sense of being watched never left. It was as if invisible eyes were tracking her every move, making sure she didn't stray from the path they had laid out for her. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, a message arrived. It was an email from Sophia. She clicked it open, her fingers trembling as she read. It's time. You've been chosen. The meeting will take place tonight at 9 p.m. Location, the old warehouse on Harbor Drive. You know what to do. Sophia. Her pulse quickened. Chosen. The word struck her like a hammer blow. What did they mean by chosen? She didn't waste any time. She was already dressed, already out the door before she had fully processed the message. If she was going to get answers, she had to confront them. Tonight. The warehouse. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows casting dark shadows across the cracked concrete. She had been here before, years ago, when she was younger, a forgotten part of town where only those who had nowhere else to go found themselves. But tonight, it felt different. The air was thick with the promise of something dangerous. She wasn't just here for answers, she was here for her freedom. As she walked through the empty lot toward the entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that whatever happened next would be the point of no return. The door creaked open as she stepped inside, and the cold, musty air hit her face. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, and for a moment, she was overwhelmed by the sheer emptiness of the place. The only sound was the soft hum of fluorescent lights flickering above her head. She wasn't alone. In the center of the room stood a group of people, their faces obscured by the shadows. She could barely make out their features, but their presence was unmistakable. They were waiting for her. Sullivan, Sophia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The woman stepped out of the shadows, her face unreadable. You made it. Why am I here? She demanded, her voice steady but laced with a growing sense of panic. What do you want from me? Sophia smiled coldly. What we want from you isn't important. What's important is what you're willing to give. Her heart thudded in her chest. Give? What did that mean? Before she could say anything else, a man stepped forward. He was tall, older, with a sharp, angular face. His eyes were dark, calculating. We've been watching you for a long time, Miss Sullivan, he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. Your skills, your drive, your ambition, all of it made you the perfect candidate. But now, it's time for you to make a decision. She swallowed hard. What decision? He stepped closer, and she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. You've proven yourself capable. But now we need you to prove your loyalty. Loyalty? Her chest tightened. What did that mean? We're offering you power, influence, a chance to rise above the ordinary, he continued. But in exchange, there are certain sacrifices that must be made. You've already signed the papers. But the true test comes now. The words hit her like a wave. Sacrifices? What kind of sacrifices? She had no idea what she had gotten herself into. The air thick with an unspoken threat. The choice. Sophia stepped forward, her eyes hard. It's simple, really. All you need to do is say yes. Agree to join us fully. Agree to follow through on the commitments you've already made. And you'll have everything you've ever wanted. She looked around at the faces in the room, all watching her intently, waiting for her answer. They had power. They had control. And they were offering it to her, if she was willing to play by their rules. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was it. The moment of truth. Say yes, the man with the sharp features said. And you'll be one of us. No more games. No more questions. Just power. The offer was tempting. Too tempting. But she could feel something deep inside her that recoiled at the thought of giving in. These people, they were playing a game she didn't want to be a part of. She couldn't let them control her. Not like this. Not without knowing what the cost would be. Her mind raced. What was she willing to sacrifice? Was it worth it? Could she really just walk away from everything she had worked for? And then, finally, the truth came to her. No. She wasn't going to be a puppet. She wasn't going to let them pull her strings. No matter what it cost her, she was going to fight. I refuse, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. I won't play your game. The room fell silent. The group of people stood motionless, as if her words had taken them by surprise. Sophia's expression flickered for just a second, anger, disbelief, but she quickly masked it with a cold smile. You made your choice, the man with the sharp features said, his voice suddenly dark. But don't think you'll get away that easily. There's always a price. The consequences. Sophia stepped forward, her voice a low hiss. You have no idea what you've just done, Ms. Sullivan. You think you can walk away from this, but you can't. We've invested too much in you. And now, there will be consequences. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. She could feel the weight of their anger, the intensity of their gaze. She had made her choice. And now she had to live with it. The silence that followed her refusal was suffocating. The room was no longer just a space filled with shadowy figures, it felt like a battlefield. The air buzzed with tension, thick with the threat of what was to come. Sophia's eyes narrowed, her smile now gone, replaced by something darker, more menacing. You really don't understand, do you? She asked, her voice low and venomous. You thought you could just walk away from this unscathed? You thought your decision would... Sophia's words struck her like a cold slap, but deep down, a part of her already knew. There was no turning back now. She had stepped too far into the game, and the only way out was through. She had no illusions about the power these people held, nor the consequences of defying them. But there was one thing they underestimated about her, her will to survive. The confrontation. The man with the sharp features, the one who had spoken about loyalty and power, took a step forward. His eyes were dark, his expression hard. You don't get it, Sullivan. You think you can refuse us without repercussions? We don't take rejection lightly. She held her ground. I don't care. I'm not a pawn in your game. His lips curled into a twisted smile. No? Well, we'll see how long that attitude lasts. You'll find that walking away from us is not an option. And I'm afraid you'll learn that the hard way. His words echoed in the cavernous warehouse, and she could feel the weight of them settle over her like a looming storm cloud. He was threatening her. But what could they possibly do to her? Her mind raced, trying to find a way out of the trap she had set for herself. Her feet were planted firmly in the middle of a battle she had never asked for, and the only choice she had now was to fight. And then, she realized something. The power wasn't with them. It was with her. The unexpected twist. She turned to Sophia, her voice steady but firm. You think I'm scared of you? Of all of you? She asked, the defiance in her words surprising even herself. You've played your hand, but I've been playing mine all along. You thought you were in control. You were wrong. Sophia raised an eyebrow, but there was something flickering in her eyes, a flash of doubt, perhaps. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. I've been gathering information, she said, meeting Sophia's gaze without flinching. You're not as untouchable as you think. This network, this whole operation, it's built on secrets. Secrets you've worked so hard to bury. But I know where they are. I know what you've done. And I can bring it all down. All I need is the right leverage. Sophia's expression faltered for a split second, a crack in her icy facade. That was the opening she needed. The revelation. The man with the sharp features sneered at her. You think you can just bring down everything we've built? You don't have the power to do that. We control everything. You think I don't know that? She shot back. But what you don't understand is that power is fragile. You may control the business, the money, the influence, but I've found the cracks. And when those cracks spread, everything you've worked for will crumble. You're not invincible. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Sophia stepped forward slowly, her eyes locking onto hers. You've made a dangerous enemy, Miss. We don't forgive. And we don't let people like you go unpunished. Do your worst, she replied, her voice steady. But know this, I'm not afraid anymore. You can't control me. Not anymore. The man's face twisted with rage. He lunged forward, his hand raised as if to strike. But before he could take another step, Sophia's voice cut through the air, sharp as a whip. Enough. He froze mid-motion, his hand hanging suspended in the air. Sophia's command was absolute, and for a moment, the room felt as if time had stopped. The tension was palpable. Sophia's eyes never left hers. You're making a mistake, she said quietly, but there was something in her voice, something different this time. A shift. For the first time since meeting her, Sophia's mask seemed to crack. The coldness that had defined her seemed to dissipate, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. For a brief moment, she looked human. The choice, revisited. The man stepped back, his face flushed with frustration. He glared at Sophia. We've let her get away with too much. She's a liability. We can't let her walk out of here alive. Sophia turned to him, her gaze ice-cold once again. We will not be doing that. There was a pause, long enough for Sophia's words to hang in the air, suspended. Then, with a sigh, Sophia turned to the woman. You're right. You have more power than we gave you credit for. But power is a dangerous thing, Miss Sullivan. And now you have a choice. The word struck like a thunderclap. A choice. What choice? She demanded. You can walk away from this. Leave everything behind. Forget about the boutique, forget about the network, forget about us. Walk out the door, and you'll never see us again. Her heart raced as she processed the offer. It sounded too good to be true. Too simple. Too clean. And what's the catch? She asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. The catch, Sophia said, her voice soft but firm, is that you'll never be truly free. You'll always be looking over your shoulder, wondering when we'll come for you. But if you stay, if you choose to join us fully, then you will have everything. The power. The influence. The life you've always wanted. For a long moment, she stood there, caught between the two worlds. Her mind raced as she weighed the impossible options before her. The weight of the decision threatened to crush her. And then, slowly, she made her choice. I choose freedom, she said, her voice clear, strong, and unwavering. Sophia's eyes flashed with something, relief, perhaps. The man with the sharp features sneered. "Good luck with that," he spat, turning away. "You'll regret this." But she didn't care anymore. She walked out of the warehouse, into the night. The city stretched before her, dark and full of possibilities, but also danger. But for the first time in the aftermath, the days that followed were both a blur and a realization. Word of her defiance spread quickly, and soon enough, the network knew she had chosen to walk away. The power, the influence, they couldn't hold her. But what they didn't know was that she had already begun to rebuild, to reclaim her life. The boutique, once a symbol of her entrapment, became her sanctuary again. It was no longer a pawn in a twisted game, it was hers. She had made it through, against all odds. And as for the network? She knew they would never truly forget her. But she didn't need them anymore. She had her own power now. The power of choice. The lesson. Sometimes, the hardest choice isn't the one that brings immediate rewards or safety. It's the one that demands the most courage, the most sacrifice. True freedom is never given. It is earned, by standing up, by choosing to walk away, and by facing the unknown head-on. She had learned that lesson the hard way. But in the end,